Welcome to the Faith and Feelings podcast. My name is Taylor Joy, and I'm passionate about helping you untangle and honor your emotions, authentically practice your faith, and integrate both into your everyday life so that you can experience the goodness and delight that comes from living in relationship with yourself, God, and others. Thank you for joining me. Let's get started. Today, we are wrapping up our series on self-awareness, and over the last few weeks, we've engaged this topic in so many different ways. We've talked about different kinds of self-awareness. We've talked about the way that pain often invites us into a deeper awareness of our own hearts and stories. We've explored what it looks like to become more and more aware of our emotions, our thoughts, and the stories our bodies are telling us. I've also invited different guests to come on the podcast and share some of their journeys with self-awareness and what they've learned along the way. And can I just say, wow, these conversations have been absolutely beautiful. What a gift these conversations have been for me personally. And I've heard from so many of you who have told me how impactful these interviews have been for you too. So if you haven't yet, I really suggest going back and listening. I was telling someone the other day that after I record these interviews, I sit with and reflect on what the guests shared all week long. I have literally not been able to stop thinking about them. They are so powerful, and they've prompted such deep reflection in me. But in every conversation that I've had with a guest in this series, I've ended our time together by asking what they are personally doing right now to grow in self-awareness. And do you know that using different words and in different ways, every guest has said the same thing? Their answer has been the same every single time: relationships. So to wrap up our series today, I wanted to end by offering some reflections on why I think relationships are the thing that most catalyze and cultivate self-awareness. And I'm also going to talk about a few ways that we can begin practicing self-awareness within relationships. So to start off, I want to re-emphasize something that TJ McLesley said in last week's episode. We were talking about the environment that he was raised in, and he said something that has stayed with me. He said that he grew up in an environment that didn't just not talk about self-awareness, but actively discouraged it. In other words, he was encouraged to not lean into self-awareness. As I've been reflecting on this, I wonder how true this is for many of us. How many of us grew up in environments that did not nurture self-awareness? Maybe, like TJ, you were raised in a faith context where you were taught that self-awareness or self-reflection was actually selfish. Perhaps you heard people talk about these practices as a form of self-centered navel-gazing. These kinds of messages can often sound something like, "Don't think about yourself. You should only think of other people. Stop being so emotional. Just snap out of it. If you think about your emotions, you're being selfish." So as younger you grew up in this kind of environment, absorbing and internalizing these messages, you were formed to practice not having feelings. Some of us were trained to disconnect, especially from difficult or more distressing emotions, because feeling these emotions was not the Christian way. Or maybe you grew up in a household that, as I've heard many people say, did not do feelings. Perhaps the phrase, "stop crying," or "I'm going to give you something to cry about," was a common phrase you heard as a child. And you know that despite the fact that logically it doesn't even make a lot of sense, as you think about it, there was this sense inside of you that you weren't really allowed to have certain feelings. And so you practiced not having feelings. You practiced not paying attention to what's happening within. And as the decades have passed, you've become 25 or 35 or 45, and you feel so disconnected from yourself. And someone might ask you, "What do you feel?" And you have no idea. Or you have the experience of having a strong gut feeling, but you ignore it, or you don't trust it. How many of us resonate with the experience of thinking or feeling things within the privacy of our minds, and we decide that we're just going to minimize it? And we begin telling ourselves the story that we shouldn't be bothered. We shouldn't be upset. We shouldn't be feeling or thinking these ways. and we send whatever it is underground. And many of us are burning so much energy containing the things that we don't want to think or feel. And this happens automatically. We're not even aware that we're burning this energy. It's become second nature to suppress our emotions, not pay attention to what's happening within, and lose touch with ourselves. And all of these little ruptures begin happening within us. And by ruptures, I mean disconnections or breakings of connection within ourselves. We come to disconnect from our tears, from our grief, from our desires, from our tenderness or sensitivity. And not only disconnect, but we begin to despise or react with violence and hatred towards these feelings or experiences within ourselves. We would rather get rid of these feelings and experiences than have them come into the room with us. And if we can't feel or pay attention to what's happening within us, we can't name what's happening within us. And if we can't name what's happening within, we can't practice curiosity towards it. And there's no space for questions or growth or expansion or self-awareness. And we begin to realize that what actually kept us safe and helped us survive as children isn't helpful as an adult. In fact, it's become the very thing that is keeping us stuck. So a question to ponder before we move on. What messages did you receive about self-awareness or self-reflection as a child? Here's why all of this is important to understand, especially in regards to our relationships with other people. These ruptures within us are the very things that create ruptures between us. To say this another way, my own disconnection from myself is what creates disconnection between me and other people. Let me give you an example of what I mean by this. Let's say that a man named John grew up in a household where that phrase, "don't cry" or "I'll give you something to cry about" was communicated to him whenever he began to cry. So as a child, he learned very quickly to disconnect from his tears. And even more so, he learned to despise them. So what happens 20 years later when John is sitting in small group and someone begins to cry? And they begin to name what feels painful, evoking all the similar feelings that reside in everyone else in the room. He begins to get anxious and irritated, and he responds quickly, rushing to offer them a phrase like, "everything happens for a reason," or "just trust God." And part of the reason why he rushes so quickly to fix them, to give some kind of logical, linear, cognitive truth, is because he's working really hard to reduce his own distress, far more than he's actually trying to comfort or help them. His motivation to help might be a byproduct, but what he's really trying to do is distance himself from their tears and from their naming what is starting to stir things within him. This happens all of the time. In staff meetings, in the grocery store, in the kitchen, we distance ourselves, react towards, or try to fix each other. Why? Because we're trying to avoid or reduce our own distress. If we can minimize someone else's feelings, prove them wrong, feel more in control, or give them a fast fact to fix their pain, then maybe they will stop naming what they're naming and we will feel less anxious. Now, when thinking about John's reaction in small group, this doesn't mean that he wasn't trying to be helpful. There's a part of him that's truly trying to help the person who's crying. But he is not aware that what he's really trying to do primarily is reduce his own distress. John's disconnection from himself and his lack of self-awareness about what's going on inside of him in the moment prevents him from drawing close to this person. And it causes disconnection between them, and most likely within the person he's speaking to. Here's another example. John's son Timothy has a tender, sensitive heart, similar to John at his age. A few days later, after his team lost a baseball game, Timothy runs up to John, tears streaming down his face, devastated and embarrassed by the loss and his own mistakes during the game. That anxious irritation begins rising up in John again, and instead of comforting his son, he pulls away and tells Timothy, "It wasn't that bad, just do better next time." Angry and distressed by his son's tears, he walks away, leaving his son sitting alone on the bleachers. Do you see how ruptures within us cause the ruptures between us? The ruptures or breakings of connection that we have with others are usually a direct result of the ruptures that we have not repaired within ourselves. So what does it look like for John to practice self-awareness here? I'm thinking about last week's episode when TJ and I were talking about God coming to Adam and Eve in Genesis 3, and TJ referenced the question that God asked them in the garden after they ate from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. He asked, "Where are you?" And TJ described this as the first self-awareness question in the Bible. God didn't come to find them with violence or condemnation, but with curiosity and a desire to be with them. And he also doesn't ask them this question because he didn't know where they were, but because he wanted them to know where they were. So for John, the first step for him might be awareness. This might look like a simple noticing that his reaction at small group or with his son had created some distance or disconnection within these relationships. Or maybe even just a sense of his own disconnection or distance from himself. And as he pays attention to what's happening around him, he might begin practicing that same posture of compassionate curiosity that God modeled in the Garden of Eden. He might ask himself, where am I? What's happening inside of me? My reaction just now didn't seem to match the situation. I wonder what that might be about. And then what does John need? He needs someone else to be curious with him. If we pay attention to small or large ruptures within our relationships and within ourselves, we'll discover God's repeated invitations to deeper exploration. As Psalm 51 says, God desires truth in the inmost being. But he did not design us to do this alone. It's actually not possible. We need the presence of other people who can help us see things clearly, who will ask us good questions and reflect back to us what they're hearing or seeing. So the next step for John might look like courageously inviting someone who is trustworthy to sit with him and practice curiosity alongside him towards what's happening within. Where are you? What are you feeling? What's happening inside of you? Tell me about your reaction. How can I be with you? This is how we begin practicing self-awareness in relationships. First, by paying attention to what's happening externally and internally. And two, by pursuing relationships with trusted people who listen well, ask good questions, and because of their own desire for greater self-awareness and growth, will allow us to do the same thing for them. So as we wrap up, think about it. Who is one person that you trust? And what might it look like to initiate a deeper level of conversation with them? To tell them that you felt the need for someone who will listen as you say things out loud and to grow in self-awareness. Tell them you would love to do this for them too, and ask how interested they would be in this kind of conversation. Set some ground rules, and then schedule a time to meet and practice processing something that's happening in your life right now. And then listen, empathize. Let your curiosity lead you. And rather than offering advice, try reflecting back what you're seeing or hearing them say. Practicing self-awareness in relationships requires intentionality and commitment to our own growth and to each other's. But I've known these kinds of relationships to be one of the most beautiful things we can experience. We were designed to exist within these kinds of relationships. They aren't an optional, but a necessary component to deeper connections with ourselves, God, and each other, the kinds of connections that God created us for. I'm so grateful that you listened to today's episode. Thank you for spending time with me. I'd love to hear from you. Connect with me on Instagram at TaylorJoy or through my website, taylorjoymurray.co. Also, if you enjoyed this conversation, it would mean so much to me if you took a minute to subscribe and review the podcast. This is an easy way to partner with me and is invaluable in reaching new listeners. Until next week.